Gabe Virelson and Tina Watson seemed like the perfect couple, young, in love, and ready to start their lives together. But behind their smiles, a dark secret lurked. When Tina's body was discovered during their honeymoon dive, what appeared to be a tragic accident quickly unraveled into something much more sinister. Detective Sura Neven's investigation would reveal a chilling truth. Gabe's calculated actions had led to his wife's death. But why? What drove him to betray the woman he had vowed to cherish? The answer would shock everyone and expose the depths of deception that lay beneath the surface. Tina Watson had always been a cautious woman. At 28, she had built a quiet, comfortable life as a nurse in Clearwater Springs, a small town where everyone knew everyone. She was known for her kind heart, her dedication to her patients, and her careful nature. Tina had always been the type to think things through, weigh every option, and avoid risks. It was this personality that made her cautious around water. As a child, she had taken swimming lessons, but she never felt truly comfortable in deep water, especially the ocean. But then she met Gabe Virelson. Gabe was a confident, outgoing man, a seasoned diving instructor who seemed to have a natural connection with the ocean. He was charming, with a smile that could light up a room, and his adventurous spirit was contagious. They met one summer, while Tina was on vacation with friends, and from the moment they started talking, Gabe's charisma was magnetic. He spoke about the ocean with such passion, about the wonders of the underwater world, and how diving was more than just a sport. It was a way to connect with nature in a way few could understand. Tina, intrigued by his enthusiasm, found herself drawn to him. She admired how he lived life on his own terms and how he seemed to push the boundaries of what she considered possible. Over the course of their relationship, Gabe introduced Tina to the world of scuba diving. Initially, she was hesitant, but Gabe's assurances and encouragement made her feel safe. "You'll love it once you try," he would say. And slowly, Tina started to believe him. Gabe took her on several shallow dives, showing her the beauty of the coral reefs, and despite her initial fears, Tina began to enjoy it. A year later, after a whirlwind romance, Gabe proposed to Tina during a trip to a secluded beach. The proposal was everything Tina had dreamed of, romantic and intimate. She said yes, and their wedding plans began immediately. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, Tina had a nagging feeling. She felt something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Gabe, however, seemed more eager than ever to plan their honeymoon. He insisted they go to the Great Barrier Reef, a place Tina had always wanted to visit. Tina wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of deep-water diving, but Gabe reassured her, promising it would be a relaxing experience and that he would take care of everything. Tina trusted him, even if she still had some reservations. The day of their honeymoon arrived, and Tina couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and anxiety. They flew to Australia, where they checked into a luxurious resort by the coast. Gabe had booked them for a private diving trip to explore some of the more remote parts of the reef. Tina was hesitant, but she wanted to make her new husband happy. Gabe had always been patient with her, encouraging her to face her fears. The morning of their second dive, Tina woke up to clear skies and calm waters. Gabe, as always, was eager, dressed and ready for the dive before Tina had even finished her coffee. On the boat, Tina felt her nerves building. She watched as Gabe spoke with the dive crew, laughing and joking, completely at ease. Tina, on the other hand, felt her heart race. She wasn't sure why she felt this way. After all, she had been diving before, and she was with Gabe, someone she trusted. But there was something about this dive that felt different. Gabe was enthusiastic, but there was a coldness in his eyes that Tina couldn't shake. It was as though he was too focused on the dive, too eager to get into the water. Sigh. The boat moved out to the dive site. Tina felt a sense of unease. The water looked darker, more intimidating than she had imagined. The crew handed out equipment, and Tina took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Gabe, noticing her hesitation, gave her an encouraging smile, but his eyes didn't seem to match his expression. Tina couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the whole situation felt off. They were the last pair to enter the water, Gabe leading the way as Tina followed closely behind. The deeper they went, the more Tina's anxiety grew. Her breathing was shallow as she tried to focus on the beauty around her, but it wasn't long before she felt a wave of panic rise within her. The deeper they descended, the further they seemed to drift from the group. She looked up and saw nothing but blue. The water was silent, except for the sound of her own breathing, and she began to feel as if she were sinking, even though she knew she wasn't. Her heart pounded in her chest and she reached for her regulator, but it felt harder to breathe. Something wasn't right. Gabe was ahead of her, barely turning back, his movements quick and purposeful. Tina tried to signal to him, but he didn't seem to notice. The fear rose within her, and before she could react, the world around her seemed to go dark. What happened next would change everything. Gabe surfaced alone, claiming that Tina had panicked and sank too quickly. He seemed calm, too calm. Divers and crew scrambled to find Tina, but it was too late. They found her body floating lifelessly underwater. Gabe's story didn't add up, but no one could understand why. What had truly happened to Tina Watson during that dive? The answers seemed buried deep beneath the ocean, and the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of Tina Watson's body sent shockwaves through everyone aboard the Coral Horizon that day. The dive crew had been trained to respond to emergencies, but no one could have prepared for something like this. Gabe Virelson was the first to surface, his eyes wide with panic, his breaths heavy from the exertion of surfacing alone. He was gasping for air. His words rushed as he explained that Tina had suffered a panic attack during the dive, and that she had descended too quickly. He claimed he tried to help her, but by the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. The crew immediately launched into action, scanning the waters for Tina's body, but the ocean seemed to have swallowed her whole. Minutes passed, which felt like hours, before they finally spotted her. When she was pulled from the water, lifeless and pale, the reality of the situation set in. Tina Watson was gone. The crew members and fellow divers who had been with them on the trip couldn't fathom how it had happened. Gabe's calm demeanor seemed at odds with the gravity of the situation, and his story didn't quite match what they had witnessed in those final moments. The captain of the boat, a seasoned diver named Reese Galvin, was the first to notice the inconsistency in Gabe's account. He had been standing at the back of the boat when the couple had gone into the water, and he had a clear view of the dive site. Reese recalled seeing Gabe and Tina dive in together, but he hadn't seen them for a long time after that. As he began to think back to the events of the dive, something didn't sit right with him. He had noticed that Gabe seemed unusually composed, far too calm for someone whose wife had just died in such a tragic manner. When the boat returned to shore, authorities were immediately notified, and the local police were called to investigate. The cause of Tina's death was ruled as drowning, but there were many unanswered questions. Gabe was questioned by the authorities, and his story remained consistent. He described how Tina had become panicked as they descended, how she had struggled to breathe, and how he had attempted to help her but was unable to reach her in time. He insisted that Tina had never been comfortable with diving and had been underprepared for the deep water conditions. But despite Gabe's assurances, there were subtle signs that something was amiss. Reese and other crew members began to share their observations. They mentioned that Gabe had been strangely distant throughout the trip. He had insisted on diving at remote, deeper sites that Tina was not ready for, and despite being a diving instructor, he had never once taken the time to practice the necessary skills with her. Tina, despite her initial reservations about diving, had trusted Gabe and followed his lead. But it seemed like she was always underprepared for each dive, as if Gabe was pushing her into situations she wasn't ready for. The police dug deeper into Gabe's background, and what they uncovered was startling. Tina's family, still in disbelief over her sudden death, began to raise their own suspicions. They had learned that Tina had recently updated her life insurance policy. A few weeks before the wedding, Tina had increased the policy's value significantly, naming Gabe as the sole beneficiary. It wasn't an uncommon practice to update life insurance before a wedding, but the timing struck Tina's parents as odd. They had always felt that Gabe was a bit too eager to push Tina into things she wasn't fully comfortable with, especially when it came to diving. As the investigation progressed, more disturbing details came to light. Gabe's interactions with Tina had always been seen as supportive on the surface, but there was a pattern of subtle manipulation. Friends and family began to recall moments when Gabe had pushed Tina to do things she wasn't comfortable with, and how he seemed more interested in his own desires than her well-being. Tina had expressed doubts to her mother in the weeks before the wedding, mentioning that Gabe had encouraged her to increase her life insurance policy, but Tina had dismissed her concerns, thinking it was just a precaution. A forensic analysis of Tina's dive computer revealed even more troubling information. According to the data, Tina's descent had been rapid and unusual. It was almost as if her buoyancy control device had been tampered with, causing her to sink far too quickly. Additionally, her air tank had been nearly full when she was found, suggesting that she had not used much of the air in her tank before she lost consciousness. This contradicted Gabe's claim that Tina had panicked and run out of air. Experts also noted that Tina's regulator had been found in her mouth in a way that suggested she had not removed it herself. As the days passed, the pressure on Gabe mounted. The inconsistencies in his story were becoming more apparent. Why had he waited so long to signal for help? Why had he not attempted to resurface with Tina immediately after she showed signs of distress? Gabe's calmness during the rescue attempt seemed suspicious, especially when compared to the frantic behavior of the other divers. The investigation soon began to take on a darker tone. Gabe's behavior, his life insurance policy, the suspicious dive data, it all painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. But there was still no concrete evidence to accuse him of foul play. The case would become a battle to uncover the truth. Behind Tina Watson's tragic death, a mystery that would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it and those who sought to uncover the truth beneath the surface. The investigation into Tina Watson's death was growing more complex by the day. Detective Sura Neven, an experienced investigator known for her tenacity and attention to detail, had been assigned to the case. She quickly realized that the story Gabe Virelson had told didn't align with the physical evidence and the testimony of those who had been on the Coral Horizon that day. Tina's death was no longer being treated as a simple drowning accident. It was beginning to look like something far darker was at play. Sura focused on the timeline of events surrounding Tina's death. Gabe had claimed that Tina had suffered a panic attack and sank too quickly during the dive, but the facts didn't add up. The dive crew, although they hadn't seen the entire dive, had observed a few key details that raised red flags. Reese Galvin, the dive leader, reported that Tina and Gabe had descended last in the group, and after they entered the water, it didn't take long for the other divers to notice that the couple had disappeared into the blue without a trace. There was no sign of distress, no frantic movements, nothing that would suggest an emergency. Reese knew Tina wasn't an experienced diver, but it seemed odd that Gabe, an instructor, hadn't kept a closer eye on her. Gabe's calmness when he surfaced alone was troubling. He was the only one who had returned to the surface without Tina. Yet he didn't immediately signal for help. Instead, he seemed almost too composed, too detached from the gravity of the situation. Reese had heard Gabe's frantic call when he finally alerted the crew, but there had been a long delay between the time Gabe surfaced and when they started their search for Tina. It was as if Gabe had waited just long enough to make sure Tina was beyond saving. The inconsistencies in Gabe's behavior were compounded by the fact that no one had witnessed Tina's panic. According to the dive leader, no one had seen her struggle at any point during the dive, and none of the other divers had heard any signs of distress from her. If she had panicked and sunk too quickly, there should have been visible signs, or at least some noise, an outburst, a splash, or a call for help. But none of that had happened. As Sura delved deeper into the investigation, she discovered that Gabe had a history of behavior that raised further questions. He had been financially irresponsible in the past, struggling with debts, and he had an unusual interest in Tina's life insurance policy. It turned out that just weeks before their wedding, Tina had updated her life insurance policy, increasing the coverage to $200,000 and naming Gabe as the sole beneficiary. It was an odd choice, especially considering the couple hadn't been married for long. While it wasn't uncommon for couples to update their life insurance, the timing of this change, right before their honeymoon, struck a chord with Tina's family. They couldn't shake the feeling that Gabe might have had ulterior motives, and they became increasingly convinced that Tina's death wasn't an accident. Tina's parents, Milena and Darren Loxley, were devastated by the loss of their daughter. But as they sifted through her belongings, they began to uncover more details that only added to their suspicions. Tina had confided in her mother shortly before the wedding, expressing doubts about Gabe's behavior. She had mentioned how Gabe had been pushing her to do things she wasn't comfortable with, especially when it came to diving. Tina's mother recalled that Tina had even mentioned that Gabe had suggested she take out a larger life insurance policy. At the time, Tina had dismissed her mother's concerns, thinking it was just a precautionary measure, something that every married couple should do. But the more Milena thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Gabe had encouraged Tina to dive deeper, to push past her fears even when she wasn't ready. He had insisted on taking her to remote dive sites, places that were not only more dangerous, but also offered less supervision. It was clear that Gabe had a different view of their honeymoon than Tina did. For him, it seemed to be more about control and less about the joy of exploring the ocean together. As Sura examined the forensic evidence, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. A thorough examination of Tina's dive computer revealed even more troubling data. It showed that Tina's descent had been rapid, much faster than would be typical for a recreational diver. The data indicated that her buoyancy control device may have been tampered with, causing her to sink much too quickly. This wasn't the behavior of a diver who was panicking. It was the result of something deliberately altered to create a situation in which Tina couldn't save herself. The fact that Tina's air tank was nearly full when she was found further reinforced the suspicion that something was wrong. If she had truly been panicking, she would have used more air. The evidence suggested that Tina hadn't had the chance to panic at all. The investigation began to shift from a simple drowning case to one of foul play. Gabe's financial motives, his behavior during the dive, and the physical evidence all pointed in the same direction. Detective Sura Neven was convinced that Gabe Virelson was responsible for Tina's death. She wasn't ready to make an arrest, just yet. But she knew that the truth was beginning to surface, like a diver rising from the depths. As the days passed, the case against Gabe grew stronger, and soon, it would be time to confront him with the damning evidence. But there was one thing that Sura couldn't shake. Something about Gabe's coldness, his detachment in the face of such tragedy, made her wonder whether there was more to his story than even she had imagined. Was Gabe truly the loving husband he appeared to be? Or was he a man whose plans had gone horribly wrong? The answers were buried in the depths, and Sura was determined to bring them to the surface. As the investigation progressed, the tension surrounding Gabe Virelson continued to build. Detective Sura Neven had pieced together a significant amount of evidence, but the most damning discovery was yet to come. The quiet town of Clearwater Springs, where everyone knew everyone's business, was in a state of shock. How could Tina Watson, a woman so full of life and warmth, end up dead on her honeymoon? And why was Gabe, her new husband, acting so strangely calm? Something wasn't right, and Sura was determined to find out what. The breakthrough came when Sura had the opportunity to interview Gabe again. After the initial questioning, Gabe had remained in the area, cooperating with authorities as they conducted their investigation. But his composure, his lack of genuine grief, was starting to seem more and more like a mask, and Sura wasn't buying it. When she sat across from him in the interrogation room, she could feel the weight of the evidence closing in on him. Gabe's carefully constructed narrative had started to unravel, and Sura knew it was time to push harder. Gabe remained calm throughout the interview, answering questions in a measured tone, but his answers lacked the depth of emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. He continued to stick to his story. Tina had panicked during the dive and had sunk too quickly. He claimed he had tried to reach her, but had been unable to save her. However, Sura's instincts told her that Gabe was hiding something, and she pressed him further. She started with the inconsistencies in his account. "You've told us, Gabe, that Tina panicked and sank too quickly," Sura began, her voice steady but firm. "But several people on the boat that day, including the dive crew, say they didn't see any signs of distress from her. She didn't make any noises. No one heard anything out of the ordinary. So why did it take you so long to signal for help?" Gabe shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze remained fixed on the table, but Sura could see the slight twitch in his jaw, the subtle shift in his body language. I don't know. I was trying to figure out what happened. I thought I might be able to help her myself. I didn't think it was as bad as it turned out to be." Sura narrowed her eyes. The more Gabe spoke, the less convinced she became. His explanation didn't make sense. A trained diver would know better than to wait in such a situation. The delay in calling for help, the lack of urgency, it all pointed to one thing. Gabe hadn't been as concerned as he should have been. "Gabe, we've also reviewed the dive data," Sura continued, pushing further. "Your wife's descent was far too fast. Something was wrong with her buoyancy control device. It looks like it was tampered with. That doesn't happen by accident. Do you want to explain that to me?" Gabe's eyes widened, but only for a moment. He quickly regained his composure and leaned forward, his tone a little defensive. "I don't know anything about that. I didn't tamper with her equipment. Maybe it malfunctioned. These things happen." Sura didn't let up. "You're telling me that you didn't notice anything unusual with her equipment, despite being a diving instructor? You didn't check it before you went into the water? You didn't notice anything that seemed off?" For the first time, Gabe hesitated. His response was weak, uncertain. I don't know. I thought everything was fine." Sura could see the cracks beginning to show in Gabe's story. His answers were becoming less coherent, his calm demeanor beginning to fray at the edges. The pressure was mounting, and she could feel him growing more uncomfortable with each passing minute. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. "Gabe," Sura said, her voice softening, almost as if she were speaking to a child caught in a lie. "We've spoken to several people who knew you and Tina. They've told us that you were pushing her into deeper dives she wasn't ready for. They've told us that you were eager to take her to more dangerous locations, even though she wasn't fully comfortable. Why did you keep pushing her to dive when she clearly had doubts?" Gabe's eyes flickered for a moment, and Sura knew she had struck a nerve. "I wasn't pushing her," Gabe muttered, his voice growing sharper. "She wanted to go. She wanted to experience everything I did. I just wanted her to see how beautiful the ocean is." Sura didn't buy it. She had seen the signs, the manipulative behavior, the way Gabe had encouraged Tina to increase her life insurance policy just before the wedding, and now this. It was becoming clearer by the minute that Tina's death had been no accident. Gabe had used his position of trust to push her into situations she wasn't prepared for, and when she was no longer useful to him, he had gotten rid of her. Gabe, We also found out about Tina's life insurance policy," Sura continued, her voice steady. "She made changes to it just weeks before your wedding. You were named as the sole beneficiary. Is that why you encouraged her to dive? To push her into something she wasn't ready for?" The room went silent. Gabe's face lost its color, and for the first time, he seemed truly rattled. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table, his gaze darting around the room, looking for a way out. "That's not why. I didn't want her to die," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I loved her." Sura wasn't convinced. His words sounded hollow, desperate. He had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the one thing that could expose him: the truth. It was becoming increasingly clear that Gabe had a plan all along, a plan to secure his future at the expense of his wife's life. As Sura prepared to confront him with the final pieces of the puzzle, she knew that the time for subtle questioning was over. It was time for Gabe to face the full weight of his actions. The final chapter of the investigation into Tina Watson's tragic death unfolded with a chilling certainty. Detective Sura Neven had gathered all the pieces she needed, but she knew that bringing Gabe Virelson to justice would not be an easy task. With his calculated demeanor and attempts to hide the truth, Gabe had spent the entire investigation evading direct confrontation. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, and Sura was finally ready to present it in full. After weeks of piecing together the facts, Sura stood in the quiet of her office, reviewing the final reports. The forensic analysis of Tina's dive equipment, the life insurance policy, Gabe's history, and the witness testimony all pointed to the same conclusion. Tina's death was no accident. It was murder. Gabe had orchestrated every detail with cold precision. The questions that lingered in Sura's mind were now clear. Why had Gabe pushed Tina into such dangerous situations? Why had he been so detached when things went wrong? And most importantly, what was he trying to cover up? The last piece of the puzzle came when Sura received a call from the lab. A forensic examination of Tina's diving gear had uncovered something damning. The buoyancy control device that Tina had been using had been tampered with. A valve had been adjusted in such a way that it would cause a sudden loss of buoyancy, making it nearly impossible for Tina to control her descent. The damage wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Someone had wanted Tina to sink quickly, to be trapped beneath the water. Gabe had spent years diving in some of the most dangerous places in the world. As an instructor, he was more than capable of recognizing the risks of malfunctioning equipment. It was impossible that he hadn't noticed the tampered valve. The evidence now told the story that Sura had suspected all along. Gabe had intentionally made sure that Tina would never return to the surface. The life insurance policy was another crucial piece of evidence. Tina had increased her coverage weeks before her wedding, making Gabe the sole beneficiary. While it wasn't unusual for couples to adjust their life insurance before marriage, the timing was too suspicious to ignore. Gabe's financial troubles were well known, and his life insurance payout would have solved all of his problems. But the push for more diving, the constant encouragement to take more risks, seemed to be more than just a shared interest in exploring the ocean. It felt like a calculated attempt to ensure that Tina's death would look like an accident. Gabe's calmness during the rescue attempts had also raised significant questions. Witnesses had described his lack of urgency when Tina first disappeared from sight. He had surfaced alone, waited far too long to signal for help, and only then did he alert the crew. Sura's gut told her that Gabe had known exactly what had happened to Tina. He had watched her sink, and then he had made sure she stayed there. The delay was no accident. Gabe was not trying to save his wife. He was trying to cover his tracks. The Yar. Final confrontation came when Sura invited Gabe to the police station for one last round of questioning. This time, there was no gentle approach. Sura had the evidence in front of her, and she was determined to hold Gabe accountable for what he had done. She knew that the time for playing nice was over. When Gabe walked into the interrogation room, his usual composure had started to falter. His face was pale, and his eyes were bloodshot, as if he had not slept in days. The pressure was finally taking its toll. Sura wasted no time. She placed the forensic report in front of him, the damning evidence of the tampered equipment, the life insurance policy, and the eyewitness accounts that painted a clear picture of a man who had killed his wife for financial gain. "Gabe," Sura said, her voice cold and unwavering, "we have everything we need. We know you tampered with Tina's equipment. We know about the life insurance policy. We know about your financial troubles, and we know you waited too long to signal for help. You planned this. You killed her." For a moment, Gabe just stared. At the table, his hands shaking slightly. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, but his usual arrogance had vanished. There was a look of defeat in his eyes, but he still refused to speak. He was silent, as though waiting for Sura to continue. "I don't know why you did it, Gabe," Sura continued, her voice never wavering. "But I know you did. You pushed her into this life. You took her down a path she wasn't ready for. And when things went wrong, you made sure they stayed that way." Gabe's lips quivered, and he finally lifted his head, his gaze meeting Sura's. For the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or the realization that everything he had worked to cover up was about to come crashing down. "Why, Gabe?" Sura asked, her voice low but filled with a quiet rage. "Why did you do it? What did Tina ever do to you?" Gabe swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. It was as if he was choking on the truth, unable to face the reality of his own actions. He sat there, his eyes glazed, lost in a world of his own regret, or perhaps something far more sinister. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Gabe spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't live with her anymore. I couldn't keep up the act. She was always too good for me, too innocent, too pure. I thought if I made it look like an accident, I could get away with it. Start over." His confession was weak. His words laced with a desperate need to justify his actions, but there was no escaping the reality. He had planned his wife's murder with cold precision, and now it was all unraveling in front of him. Sura leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Gabe's. The confession was enough, but the weight of his actions, the coldness behind them, was what would define this case. Gabe Virelson had murdered Tina Watson for his own selfish reasons, and now the truth had come to light. He would pay for what he had done, and the life of an innocent woman would not be forgotten. As Gabe was led away in handcuffs, Sura knew that justice had been served, but the memory of Tina's life and her tragic death would remain forever in the minds of those who had fought to bring the truth to light.